Okay, great, fantastic. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Urban Design Challenge 2020 Expert Talks Design Series. So, for everyone, just a little bit of context. This challenge is inviting creatives and problem solvers across different industries in Cambodia, to participate and to try and find a solution to our waste issue, starting with a humble public waste bin. So this is a project by the UNDP in collaboration with the IDEA Consultancy. I'm Sophia, and I will be guiding the discussion this morning. We're here today with Ian Jones. Hi, Ian. Good to have you.
Thanks very much, Sophia.
Thank you for joining. Thank you for your time this morning. So you are, just to sort of introduce you firstly, you are the executive director at Agile. You are an inclusion specialist and also an advocate of human-centered design in Cambodia. Could you tell us maybe a little bit more about what Agile does, what projects you've launched here, and just about your interests in this area?
Yeah, sure. My interest in this area actually started about 10 years ago when I was designing social enterprises and employment for people with lived experience of mental illness or looking after their mental health. But our work in Cambodia over the last 7 years has been around looking at the fusion of human-centered design and creating opportunities for people with disabilities and mainly physical impairments. So this has ranged from using human-centered design and user-centered design for water and sanitation and health for people with disabilities, right through to creating accessible hotels, accessible tuk-tuks, the mobility tuk that means a wheelchair user doesn't need to get out of their chair to transition into transport. And also recently we adapted with UNDP funding what we call an ability tuk. It's a Bajaj Maxima that's converted to hand control only. So people with lower limb impairments or not as much power in their legs can actually purchase and modify a three-wheeled tuk as their own personal transport or potentially go and work for Grab.
Oh, very cool. And I've seen the mobility tuk when it sort of first launched a few years ago, I believe, but I haven't seen this latest one with the Bajaj. When are we going to start seeing that around town? And will that be in Phnom Penh or elsewhere in a different city?
So basically it's in Phnom Penh. We converted it and it's actually now owned by Phnom Penh Centre for Independent Living. They're a local disabled people's organisation or DPO. So basically the prototype's been done and we've done all of the research to look at barriers to driving and barriers to entering the market. And then basically PPCIL now own that project. So hopefully they can work closer with UNDP and other funders to get some more of them on the ground.
All right, cool. Okay, thank you for that introduction. So let's get right into it. I'm going to set the scene a little bit because this challenge really opens up, participation across different industries and obviously designers with various backgrounds and experiences. And I just wanted to sort of look into inclusive design. So when we talk about designing for inclusivity, what do we actually mean by that?
I think probably one of the simplest sort of ways to describe it is using design principles to design for a specific need. And in the way that we look at it when we talk about specific needs, it's most often associated with designing for people with disabilities, or we prefer people with impairments. So in this case, it can be a physical impairment, maybe you have a lower leg injury or you have an arm that's amputated, or it could be a visual impairment, is that you can't see as clear as everybody else, or it could be a hearing impairment. Now there's a whole range of this, so I won't go into it too much, but basically inclusive design is how can we design products and services or environments, more importantly, for people with disabilities. Now, in the perfect world, you have at one end, we call it universal design, and that's when you're actually designing buildings and spaces and products that cater for a range of those impairment types. But in this case, we look at very specifically just inclusive design as a targeted user for this.
Okay, great. And that's sort of more generally what inclusive design is. Now let's look, I guess, let's focus in on a little bit about the challenge and about the public waste bin, right? Um, I mean, you could address this in whatever order you like, but why is it important to design for inclusivity? One, and I think obviously for people in the area that are familiar with this might be very, very intuitive, but perhaps people who are hearing it for the first time could learn a few things. Like, why is it important, first of all? And then, second, why is it important in the context of this bin design challenge?
Okay, so I'll try and approach this from a few different angles. One is probably the simplest one, and having a term like design for all or designing for a better tomorrow.
Mm-hmm.
Um, when you when you think about designing for all, globally 15% of the population are living with some kind of disability. Now, the Cambodian statistics rate very low, as reported, but in fact, most people in the sector believe that it's much higher and closer to the 15% because of the previous, um, you know, injuries and impairments caused through war, landmines, etc. So
Right.
in that case, you can also then start looking at an aging population, right? Everyone's grandmas and grandpas are getting older, and you want to design for all so that as we age and we're not as flexible and nimble as we were before, you still want people to be able to access society. So that's one way we approach it. But I think with the younger generation of Cambodians is actually you want to design for a better tomorrow. And that's because we look at design for all, but you look at what's happening in the future. And in this regard, we talk to the statistics around what's happening in Cambodia is that impairments and injuries caused by unexploded ordnances and landmines is actually decreasing because of all the work that's been done. But what has changed is that injuries through accidents has increased exponentially, whether it's the lack of using helmets or the wearing flip-flops on motors. If you get hit by a car, you're going to break your leg most of the time or have an injury, which that will either result in what we call a temporary impairment, meaning that you can't do things as quickly or as normally as you would, or a permanent impairment. And this is why we design for a better tomorrow, because until we start looking at what are the contributing factors to injury and impairments or disability, then we have to design for the future as well.
Great. Those are all very good points, actually. And you sort of touched upon this lightly, but maybe we can go in a bit more detail on and more specific to the bin challenge. Is that who would you be including? Who should we include when we're designing for inclusivity? Who do we include for this bin challenge in particular? I mean, we have people with disability, but who else? Who else should we try to consider?
Well, I think what you're looking at is looking at possibly the first user group. And as I said, universal design is a perfect way to be inclusive for all, but it's very hard to achieve depending on the influencing factors in the environment. So in terms of the urban challenge, one of the easiest things to look at is making sure that it's physically accessible. Now, this can actually be determined around the environment that it's put at and leveraging City Hall to make sure that you can actually access the bin in the first place. But if you're talking about types of physical impairments, then it could be wheelchair users. They're actually a great segment to design for because they need physical access to move up to the bin. They need to be able to reach the bin, and then they need to be able to roll away from the bin. So if they're moving up to it, then you're most likely going to have a ramp or a very, very small, step or curve from the side of the road, which means that if you have a lower limb or leg impairment, you can use that ramp as well. Another way to look at it is start folding in some very simple design for visual impairments, okay? Which basically means you're starting to look at, okay, if I've got multiple bins, can I have contrasting colours? Or if you have a black bin and you're trying to educate people about how to separate waste, then do you have contrasting colours against the black with very simple, easy to read icons that allow people to make that distinction of where they need to put things?
Right, good. And uh, for people who again have never designed for inclusivity, where should they start? Where's a good place in terms of process? How should they begin this thought process? And also, I think what's important is when do they recognize when they've sort of done that work and they're ready to sort of move forward with a design? Where do they set these boundaries and how, I guess?
I think the first thing you start with is empathy, or as we also, one of the ways of saying, put yourself in other people's shoes. If you're thinking about a user that you want to base your design around, maybe there's someone already in your community or in your family that's already having problems or difficulties moving or doing normal tasks, and design it around them. If you don't have that as a guide, there are a lot of ways that you can actually do this exercise for yourself. And when we teach universal design, one of the things we actually do is sort of strap a piece of plastic pipe that we've adapted to the back of someone's leg so they can't bend their knee. And that's the ultimate sort of thing in empathy, because if you do that and then you try to go to a squat toilet, then you're going to find out how hard it is to actually do that without things like assistive devices and rails, right? The same thing, you can do this exercise, strap a pillow to your stomach, and talking about temporary impairments like pregnancy, where it restricts some of your movement. There's a lot of ways for you to do it. Smear some Vaseline on a pair of glasses if you're trying to look at sight impairment. But either way, what I'm saying is use empathy and be creative to start the design process. Eventually when you're starting to look at prototypes, a lot of the work we do in disability is about nothing about us without us. Now, it doesn't mean you don't have to initially start talking with someone with a disability, but it means you take that prototype to the communities you're working for and with, and they will give you that feedback as well.
Okay, so it sounds like, from our conversations with other experts in the area as well, is that it really is very important to know who will be using your product or your system, and also have conversations with them or spend some time with them, really figuring out what their day-to-day looks like and how this interaction could be possible or made easier. But we're looking at, I guess we've been looking a lot at the general public users. How about the angle of the waste collectors or the economies around waste, actually, what happens to waste once it's been discarded? Is there any, do you have any comments on like why, is it important to go that far as well? Is it important to think, okay, waste collectors who potentially have disability, and why is it important to consider these things?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, there's two things for this. One is that if you don't design for an inclusive world, then there's so many opportunities that you miss out on. And there's many social enterprises globally that hire people from disadvantaged communities that actually do waste sorting. I mean, Australia has a number of them. So if you don't design that process downstream in the value chain, then how can you ever leverage the opportunity for later on? You know what I mean? So when you're looking at user-centered design and you're talking about what types of waste is going into the bin, so then you're talking about what's the hole size, right? If you can't put something in the bin, well, it's useless. If you're talking about what access do the Achais need, if the Achais are actually collecting it, or is it Sintry or Gaia collecting it? What are the pathways to that? So do you try and reach things from the top of the bin, or do you take the bin out the front? Because if you're taking it from the top, you're putting someone under physical pressure and labor, and that's actually not healthy.
Yeah, exactly.
So this is the way you look at empathy and walk yourself through the design process or the user experience. So what can we do? We look at the user experience through all of it. What does it mean to approach the bin? How do I put things in the bin? How do I know the difference between the bins? Is it easier to see the difference? Okay, now this is also because the Achais generally come from a background that might have lower education than everyone else. So you want to use simple iconography to even do that. But again, what's happening when, building a better future, when the garbage truck or Achais come, or they take it to Vietnam, or they take it to a waste sorting department, if we don't lead by example in terms of how we separate and how we collect it, then other ecosystem actors like the government, possibly won't design the separation practices at the waste facility because then they just deem it too hard. So the question is, how can we make the collection, transport, separation and disposal of waste as easy as possible for all?
I mean, that sounds, the way that you're discussing it sounds like it could be, well, perhaps you make it sound quite easy, but I know that it's, for a lot of people, that's going to be quite challenging. What are the sort of immediate challenges that you imagine people that are sort of encountering this for the first time could face when they start their process? What are the main challenges that anybody who's new to designing for inclusivity could face, and how could they overcome that? What resources do they have? Yeah.
Okay, so there's a couple of things. One is everyone tends to try and go for very attractive and sexy designs first, right? But I think, but the thing is, look at the functionality first. So we say form follows function. Look at what's happening and what you need it to do, and then look at the form to do that, and then put in the more attractive elements of what's happening. Make it art later, you know what I mean? Because if it's a beautiful bin, but there'd be nothing worse than producing a beautiful bin that no one uses, right? And that's happened, and not just here, it's happened in Australia in terms of when they looked at organic waste separation and they missed a classic design failure, and all the crows and animals and the rats had a field day because the way that they designed it meant that it was hard for the garbage workers to take out, but easy for every other animal to go in and have a mega picnic. So,
right.
So you need to look at.
I mean, it's about. Yeah.
Sorry, what were you saying?
No, yeah, it's about, like how do you access it, but also in a lot of ways, how do you restrict access to to certain, animals or how would you make it so that kids are not able to topple it over easily if they're running around, or that it's safe even if they're running around, that they don't end up tripping on it or cutting themselves on it, right? So it's a lot of that, who can access and who should not be able to access the bins.
Yeah, totally. So there's a couple of ways you can approach that, and one of that's just mapping out or listing all the people you think that will interact with the bin. Rats, kids, adults, garbage workers, and find out what they need from it. But to go back to how do you look at getting that design done first, there's two ways. One is you don't need to reinvent the wheel. It's quite possible that the design that you're looking for exists somewhere else in the world, or multiple designs. So it's about how can we adapt it to the Cambodian environment. Okay, there's no need to hurt your brain when someone else has already done it for you. And then the other thing is just a prototype. I mean, Scotch tape and cardboard. Put some designs together. See if you can roll past it. So not see if it can topple over if it's made of cardboard, but you know what I mean. It's like, let's look at the height of the hole. Because again, if you're trying to look at behaviour change, right, and you're trying to look at kids picking up garbage and helping them build a greener Cambodia, then you want to make sure your bin is accessible to children as well.
Yes.
So go through that user experience of the key actors or key stakeholders or key users, whatever the term you want to use. But yeah, definitely use empathy, keep going through the design process, look at the functionality first, put the form together, and then put the beautiful overlay on top of that.
Okay, there's a question. I think it's also sort of okay. So there's an important consideration when it comes to the criteria that will inevitably be raised, and that's the cost of materials that are going to be used to build the spin unit. Do you think that could be potentially a challenge, especially when you're no longer just designing for functionality, but you're also designing to think about users that perhaps are outside of your the immediate users that you can think of, right? Is it possible with a cost limit to create something, or like a budget limit to create something that is inclusive? Or what are sort of the I guess if there are any misconceptions about designing for inclusivity, does that mean it has to be very technologically advanced, or like, for example, the mobility tuk, that what is the technology involved in that, and what are the cost implications of that?
Yeah, I'll give you two examples on this. For the mobility tuk, effectively the Remok tuk is a box on wheels. You know, innovation doesn't have to be hard. It's quite simple. All we did was remove one end of the box and put a ramp on it and did some slight adjustments inside so that you could take the seating in and out. The impact that it had on people's lives who have previously been touched getting in and out of a tuk-tuk is incredible in terms of independence. When you look at, you know, how do you do low-cost designs? Well, Cambodia already has it. You look at the recycled truck tyres that are turned into bins, right? Now they're low, they're durable.
Right, yes.
But the lids are also very heavy. Now, do you want to, I mean, so they're not necessarily as easy to get. But these, like, things exist. When you're talking about cost prototyping, I would suggest to people, look, you might not be able to make a prototype for $100 now. But the important thing is to communicate to Urban and UNDP that once your prototyping has been done, there's potential that you could do injection molded plastic, roto molded plastic, that would make these bins actually viable in terms of coming in under the $100 budget. But you need to be able to explain that, and you need to be able to say, okay, this is where I'm looking to the future. Because when you're developing things, you need to look at including all of the costs. And unfortunately, when you start up a new design, the research and development and prototyping costs can be quite high, but it doesn't mean that you can't achieve that target $100 bin in the end. You know what I mean?
Right. So we talked a little bit about, we've just covered a little bit about the cost, but you've also, you know, worked very specifically on waste management projects. So I'm not sure whether this is in Cambodia or elsewhere, but what are your, you know, what are some of the learnings that you would like to share with the current audience or the participants of this challenge? And just a reminder as well, anybody who has any questions for Ian we'll have the floor at the end of the discussion, or you can drop your questions in the chat. Yeah. So yeah.
Yep, cool. So basically, in terms of waste environment here, I was a guide coach for a competition called the Plastic Starter Challenge. And what I was looking at is reducing waste in Southeast Asia through using artificial intelligence programs. So basically mentoring teams that work with street workers in India right through to picking facilities and separation facilities. And they're able to raise investment around that. And they're currently designing an app to make it easier for the Ajais to calculate how much money they'll get out of that waste too. Other ones are looking at much larger scale corporate things. And then also a Cambodian innovator looking at AI to work with the waste management companies to identify the size of the load on the sides of the street so that they can maximize the efficiency of when they're booking trucks or small cars or small vehicles to go down small streets and increase efficiency and pickup and all of that. So there's a whole range of things that we worked on. That could be relevant.
So you're looking at designing the ecosystem around it. So really, like, you're interested in making sure that it's not just one aspect. You know, you're not designing one aspect in isolation of the others, but looking at an entire system, right? And, you know, do you think it's important that we recognize obviously that the public waste bin is one element, and there are many different things that need to come together, you know, to make this system work. Do you think it is important for us to consider public-facing infrastructures like the waste bin, and to look at that at this point, or how important do you think a role it plays in that whole ecosystem?
Look, it's very important, because basically you want to innovate and inspire people in the ecosystem around you. Things that we do know is that, you know, the Prime Minister wants to create a better waste-free environment, because the Ministry of Environment are pushing very hard to make things happen. We know Phnom Penh City Hall is pushing very hard to look at waste services. Sihanoukville, Svariang, Barvet, even the smaller towns are looking at ways to improve their waste collection facilities. So we know that's a given, right? But when we're designing, you have the opportunity to influence. So we're talking about access, right? If you're saying, well, this is my bin and this is the amount of space it needs, but you need to have a ramp for it or something. Because I'll give you an example from the disability sector. Around Street 240 and as at Dome Pen, you can see now that there are what they call tactile tiles. An issue with Cambodia is that the local council don't own the footpaths. Individual people and businesses own footpaths, which means that if you're in a wheelchair, there is no consistent path. So in a point of innovation, City Hall then developed an area where they actually updated all of the footpaths and put in the yellow tactile tiles, which means that people with vision impairments can use it with a cane or feel it or see it. Perfect. But if you don't take the next step, which is educating everyone about what a tactile path is for, it's used incorrectly. So if you today go to the corner of Street 240 and Norodom, I can guarantee that on that tactile pathway, which is to allow people to walk barrier-free without hitting anything, there are two very heavy pot plants. So what I'm saying here is you can build, right? You can build the innovation, but if you don't educate people how to use the innovation, it will just go back to what it was before. So now we have an accessible walkway that's not actually accessible.
Right. Yeah, I was going to say that I would have, if you hadn't pointed that out, actually, I would have never noticed it. And perhaps, you know, if people with cars or with motorbikes and they're not aware of this, they would just happily sort of park on top of that. And again, making it very inaccessible. Of course, if the two pot plants weren't there, then that would be sort of open for everybody to just sort of, you know, ignore and completely dismiss as just something that looks different, but not necessarily something that has a very important function, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. I think you've covered a lot of very important and useful information and helpful for the participants. Maybe we just sort of step away from the different hats that you wear and just go back to being part of the general public. Right? And this is just a question that we've given to other speakers: is that what does your ideal bin actually look like? So, I mean, obviously, your experiences and your work will inevitably bias that answer, but yeah, what does that look like? What do you want it to fulfill? What do you want it to do?
And it's almost like asking me to create a how might we design question. You know, how might we design a bin that is accessible for as many people as possible, that separates waste into easily separated categories as well. I mean, what does it look like? I mean, it's something that you can easily get into or get access to for both people and people with impairments, right? That can be easily distinguished by people with visual impairments. Now, whether the bins are all the same colour, but the stickers are a very different contrast in colour, it's one thing. You want something that isn't going to restrict collection capacity, but at the same time, you also want to look at what is the optimum size for it so it doesn't overflow. So it might be that you're not looking at a tall bin for capacity. You're looking at a much lower, wider, longer bin, so that, you know, kids, grandparents, people in wheelchairs can all access it, but it has enough storage capacity so that, you know, it can last a whole day.
Okay. And you've actually given an example of what a bad bin looks like earlier. You said that was like somewhere in Australia where, you know, animals were able to easily access it. Have you seen a really, really good example of a bin during your travels, or, you know, when you're working on projects? Have you seen one that you've remembered and that you're like, yeah, that's the sort of bin that people should be using as a model? I mean, what does that look like? You've just described sort of the ideal bin. Have you seen one in real life that you would think is as close to your ideal bin as possible?
Probably not one I could isolate. I mean, most of the ones you see have a top opening, have a side opening for basically societies where the smoking is prevalent or people smoke near bins outside of offices. You can see that there's a separation even of cigarette butts because they take a very long time to decompose. Right. But honestly, I think it's just, for me, it's about having, you know, isolating the different components that you want to segregate or keep separate, and having 3 individual bins just for that. So that's what I mean. You design a simple bin that basically the only variation is the stickers or the logos you put on the front. That's what I would say would work, because what happens then is you start to get economies of scale in terms of production. Things that probably don't work, because of bins exposed to the air, is looking at trying to incorporate too much digital technology. Because digital technology is expensive and it just introduces another design component that can break. So it's nice if you say I've designed a bin that tells you when it's full, but then what happens when the technology breaks? Then it goes back to just being an ordinary bin. Whereas what would be better is actually having more regular waste management services.
Right, and that's actually a very important, I'm glad that you raised that, because that's a very important part of the criteria for this design challenge is, are if you've designed a bin that is easy to manufacture locally, as well as maintain and repair, right? So thank you for raising that. I think, again, we've covered a lot of things. If there are any questions, maybe just open the floor up for questions for Ian. Do we have anything on the chat? We have a question. Yep. Okay. Yep. All right. Well, if not, then I again just thank you for your time this morning, Ian, for all the insights that you provided. And if there are any questions later on, the participants could always reach out to us through the UNDP Facebook page. And there are many ways to sort of, this was already addressed. Okay, sorry. Correct, yeah, we will address that. Sorry, there's a question coming in and we need to address that later on for the design criteria. But thank you very much for that, Ian. Thank you for your time.
That's okay, thank you.
Yep, thank you very much.
Thank you for everyone for participating too. It's nice to see that people actually care enough to call into a talk on inclusion, because it's definitely not something that's front and center offer enough.
Yeah, and at 10 in the morning as well. So that's very promising. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye, everybody.